So let's talk about Israel's plan to annex the West Bank. This whole thing is it's very remarkable to me because we are in the middle of a pandemic. Millions of people have been infected with COVID-19. Hundreds of thousands of people have been wiped out by coronavirus. Over 125 Americans wiped out by coronavirus. In fact, things are so bad that medical experts have been projecting that by October, hundreds of thousands of people in Latin America will be wiped out by COVID-19. It really is that moribund, sad, and devastating. But in the midst of all of this chaos and misery and death, Israel is talking about annexing the West Bank. You would think that in this situation, in such a situation like this, Israel would be talking about fighting coronavirus. Israel would be fixated on COVID-19, working with other countries in a unilateral cooperative for fighting against this, this contagion, fighting against this pandemic. But no, that's not what's happening, actually. What's happening is the government in Israel. Of course, we all know, okay, Israeli scientists are working on a cure, on a vaccine, on antibodies against coronavirus. God bless those people. I am not talking about those people. I'm talking about the political opportunists within the Israeli government. Right now, the political opportunists in the Israeli government are using the situation of COVID-19. They're using all of the attention that the media has been focusing on with coronavirus as a way to commit to this agenda. And it's actually a perfect opportunity to advance this agenda, especially when the Trump administration is backing the state of Israel. Jared Kushner is supporting this. You have the American ambassador in Israel also expressing full support, emphatic support for this plan. So Israel is really capitalizing on this whole situation in which the media has been paying so much attention to coronavirus, and more so than Israel. So they're taking advantage of the situation, and they're using coronavirus as a distraction to go on with this agenda, because everyone right now is focusing on COVID-19 and not Israel. Well, most people are, that is. So Israel wants to annex the West Bank. Israel wants to take the Jordan Valley. The Jordan Valley is the most fertile, the most fecund piece of land that the Palestinians are currently inhabiting because, and the Palestinians are so distraught about this because the Jordan Valley is where they cultivate and grow fruits and vegetables. It's a very important agricultural center for the Palestinians. The Israelis want to take it so they can build military bases. The Israelis are also using the presence of strong concentrations of Jewish settlements in the West Bank they're using the strong clusters of Jewish settlements in the West Bank so that they could take those territories. They want to take the territories where you have Jewish settlements and annex them for the state of Israel. Now, this is extremely dangerous for a number of reasons. One, if the Israelis do this, anti-Semitism is going to explode. We all know a lot of people hate the Jews, and it's very true. There is a lot of anti-Semitism in the world. In fact, I would say right now we are seeing more anti-Semitism that the world has ever seen since the Third Reich. I'm not exaggerating about this. After the Second World War, hating Jews became very taboo. People who hated Jews, they kept it to themselves for the most part. You had, of course, people going to the forest and talking about, white power and how they hate the Jews and all that, but those people became pretty much a fringe element in society that nobody cared about. Now, anti-Semitism, hatred against Jews, has been entering the mainstream to the point that you can just go on YouTube, watch a documentary on the Holocaust, pause the video, read the comments, and you will read all sorts of horrible, demonic, vitriolic statements against Jews. It's very, very nasty. In fact, there was a George Floyd protest in Paris, and you could hear crazy left-wing fanatics talking about dirty Jews and how the Jews are dirty And it really goes to show how hatred against the Jews is not only prevalent within right-wing factions, but also hard left-wing factions as well. The hatred for Israel can be found in both the left and the right. Of course, there is legitimate criticism for Israel. There is legitimate criticism that can be made against Israel, absolutely. Criticism of a government is not racist unto itself. But there is definitely the reality of people criticizing Israel with evil motivations. There is definitely the reality of people who criticize Israel with absolute evil hatred and vitriol. That is a reality, and that is what I'm talking about here. I am not talking about legitimate criticism for the state of Israel, because you have Israelis and Jews who also criticize the state of Israel for these types of policies. So I'm not talking about those people. Now, if Israel annexes the West Bank, it's going to be because America allowed it to. Just like America said, hey, we're going to make the U.S. embassy in Israel, we're going to put it in Jerusalem. And that was something that caused some escalation. A lot of people were angry about that. But it's just an embassy. It's just a building at the end of the day. Israel wasn't conquering anyone's land in that particular situation. But if Israel commits to this objective, Israel is going to be conquering land. It's going to be taking land. Now, they say it's annexation. This is just a nice diplomatic way of saying conquering. All right, it's expansionism. It's like Turkey going into Libya in the name of supporting the guy who's against Haftar. I forgot his name, but the reality is that Turkey is going there to conquer and to expand. That's just the reality of it. This is how diplomatic war works today, and I say diplomatic war in a very ironic way. But this is how expansionism is done today. Back in the day, you know, people could be very obvious and say, I want to conquer you, I hate you, I want to kill all of your people. Nowadays, people don't say that so much because of the Second World War. We just say, hey, in the name of Homeland Security and unilateral cooperation with other countries, we're going to expand into this certain area. Okay, it's just how things work today. So Israel wants to conquer Palestinian land. That's what this is. And America is going to allow it if it takes place. And people are going to... There's a very common narrative in anti-Jewish ideology, and that is America is a puppet of Israel. America is a puppet of the Jews. And people are going to say things like, well, Israel conquered or Israel annexed the West Bank because America allowed it, and America is controlled by Jews. Jared Kushner is a Jew, etc., etc., etc. Okay, we've all heard this type of... Well, maybe you haven't, but I've heard this sort of thing many times. And so this narrative is going to become even more popular. It's going to be amplified. Now, here is another thing that makes the situation so volatile and dangerous. If Israel annexes the West Bank, it's going to do so in a very scary time. We are living in a very volatile time, and it's only going to get more and more capricious and unstable. In fact, I was reading an article today. It was published by a very strange investment... they do political analyzations for financial investment, which is very strange and suspicious. But the name of this website is called Freedom Lab. And in this website, they had a recent article about Generation Alpha and the Zoomer generation. Now, we have the millennials, which is the generation that I belong to, but then you have the Zoomers, which is the next generation after the millennials, and then you have Generation Alpha, because, hey, you know, you have X, Y, and Z. Zoomers are the Z generation, so there are no letters after Z, so you have to go with Greek terms. So they say Generation Alpha, which is actually kind of disturbing, given the fact that a lot of Nazis love to talk about how alpha they are and how beta their enemies are. So we have a new generation called Generation Alpha. And in this article, it talked about how Generation Alpha and the Zoomers are going to grow up in a time when America is no longer going to be the central force governing the world, which means they're going to be living in very volatile times. Because when you have a country, when you have an empire, a hegemony like America, weaken or withdraw from the world or go into a more isolationist and protectionist position, well, nature hates a vacuum, and other countries, very powerful countries, are going to want to fill in that vacuum in order for them to become what America is currently today. They want to become the governing force of the world, be it Japan in Northeast Asia, be it Turkey in the Middle East, be it Germany in Europe. These countries want to become a force to be reckoned with, globally speaking. And so we are heading towards that. We are heading towards a time when things like nationalism are only going to get worse. They're only going to be worse. You know, we talk about Jared Taylor and Richard Spencer, and we say, look, you know, these people are evil Nazis. And they are. They are evil Nazis. They're absolutely despicable people. But these people are only breaking the ice. These people are the foreshadowers of worse things to come. They are the precursors to the Antichrist. It's like Jesus Christ had John the Baptist. John the Baptist was the foreshadower of Christ. The Antichrist, while being the opposite of Christ, he wants to be like Christ. He wants to mimic Christ. The Antichrist is also going to have his foreshadowers. In fact, we have seen many foreshadowers to the Antichrist: Muhammad, Joseph Smith, etc., etc. These alt-right speakers that we see today, they're breaking the surface. They are slowly desensitizing people to these sorts of ideas. People who advocate for things like Brexit, for things like anti-migrant hysteria, these people are only breaking the ice. The reason for that is because after the Second World War, you know, things like racism and promoting genocide became very taboo. So how do you make the Western world accept Nazism again? How do you make fascism fashionable again? You have to give people an enemy. In this particular context, in our own current time, the enemy is the migrant. The enemy is Antifa. So they are using the problems with migration, they're using the Antifa as a way to boost up the other side. I've been talking about this for years. Strategy of tension. Boost up the left, and inevitably you are going to get a violent, reactionary, right-wing response. It's very, very real. And we saw this in the First World War. We saw this sort of thing in the Second World War. Very, very conspicuously, very obviously. It was there. They're trying to bring back this stuff again. And just because you had a war doesn't mean this stuff just disappeared. This stuff is very, very strong in the countries that it was present in the first half of the 20th century. It's just being marketed in a different way. Whew, that was a mouthful. So, if Israel annexes the West Bank, it's going to be doing so in a time when things like ultranationalism are very popular, in a time when things like protectionism, things like racial pride are very, very popular. They're growing in popularity. If you don't believe me, look at the fact that Ukrainians are still worshiping Stefan Bandera. Look at the fact that Croatian nationalists have inundated the Croatian government and they love the Ustashi. There are numerous examples. The fact that the Japanese love Shinzo Abe and his right-wing fascist party, and they're talking about going nuclear. The fact that one of the most popular parties in Germany right now is a fascist party, the AfD, and the Germans are talking about making the German military great again and making Germany a nuclear country. It's already a de facto nuclear state, but they have the technological capacity to become nuclear. And all it's going to take is about 6 months, and Germany would be a nuclear country. The Germans, very prominent voices in German politics, they want to make this happen. This is very real. What I'm saying is not just some crazy conspiracy. It's very real. So if Israel annexes a country in such, or not really officially a country, but if Israel annexes the West Bank, it's going to be doing so in a time when nationalism is growing in popularity. What's that going to do? It's going to set a precedent for other countries. What's one of the biggest narratives that came out of the alt-right? It was, if Israel could have an ethno-state, why can't white people have their own ethno-state? If Israel can have an ethno-state of Jews, why can't Germany have a country for Germans? If Israel can have a country for Jews, why can't Sweden have a country for Swedes? Why can't Germany have a country for Germans? Why can't the Dutch have a country for ethnic Dutch people? The alt-right has been very focused on utilizing this type of argument, using Israel as a precedent. Now, I understand why Israel is the way it is. There was a Holocaust, there was a horrific genocide, and because so much of the world hates Jews, the Jews said, let's have a land for our own. And that's completely understandable. I am against the idea of Jewish supremacy and racism against Palestinians. At the same time, I understand why they established this idea of Israel, because so many people hate Jews. Well, give those people a nation so they can be left alone. It's like Armenia. You know, Armenians were butchered for a very long time by the Ottoman Empire. Armenia has a very young country. Armenia is a very young country. I mean, the modern day state of Armenia is a very young country. Armenians deserve their own state as well because of the horrific persecution that they went through. But if Israel annexes the West Bank, which would not be right, by the way, I don't agree with this idea at all, it's going to set a very dangerous precedent. And there are many countries that have territorial disputes. There are many countries that have territorial disputes. It just so happens that Israel is the only country that receives American support for its territorial dispute. It receives, well, I shouldn't say the only, but it's the country that receives the most amount of support from the US when it comes to a territorial dispute. Ukrainian nationalists, they want to take territory from Poland that they believe belongs to them. Japanese nationalists, they are in a territorial dispute. Hell, the Japanese government is in a territorial dispute with Russia over the Sakhalin, which is a chunk of land that's right in between, well, it's part of Russia, but it's very close to Japan. It used to be controlled by the Japanese. I believe the Japanese took it from the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, and then in the end of the Second World War, the Russians took it back. You have a territorial dispute between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. You have a territorial dispute between Greece and Turkey. There are numerous territorial disputes in the world right now, and they are nationalists in these countries who are just itching to make their utopian vision into reality and take territory. And one argument that they could use is, well, if Israel could do it, why can't we? What's so wrong about taking territory that belongs to our people because of our history and it belonged to our ancestors? What's stopping the Hindus from saying, as the Israelis took the territory of the barbarian Palestinians because they are proud to be Jewish, they are proud of Judaism, they are proud Jewish nationalists, then we the Hindus are proud Indian nationalists, proud Hindu nationalists. I mean, what's stopping them from doing that? So what Israel wants to do, if they succeed, they are going to set a very dangerous precedent. And if you have this escalation where countries begin to expand into other territories, you're going to see an escalation towards the next world war. So it's very, very dangerous, and it's leading the world into a very volatile situation. Anyway, hope you guys have enjoyed this message. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.